You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Welcome to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Walker, and joining me today is my very good friend and longtime gaming buddy, Dustin Archer. Welcome, Dustin.
Thank you, Rob. Glad to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about a pretty fun topic, which is building backwards. And specifically what we're talking about is building your campaign backwards or an adventure backwards, starting with your idea at the end and moving back to the beginning. But before we get into that, let's introduce ourselves a little bit to my friend Dustin. This is your first time joining me on my podcast, but we've been gaming together for a very long time.
25 years or thereabouts.
Wow, man, the time really flies.
Oh,
doesn't
it does. It does.
So can you tell me, you're the person who got me into D&D in the very first place. My very first game was something that you introduced me to, and it's become a pretty significant part of my life. Can you tell me a little bit about your gaming journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I still remember when I was probably fourth or fifth grade, and I was at the library here in town, and I picked up a first generation player's handbook from the original version of D&D, and I created a character, and it was a rogue who was like an artifact thief who was going around and trying to be a lot of subterfuge and a lot of fun, and I did my own stories in my head. So it was really a pleasure once the third edition of the rule set for the Dungeons and Dragons rule set came out, and I got a hold of those books, and that was right around the time where you and I really started getting going and jumping into the adventure. Although, if I recall correctly, we played a little bit at the end of that advanced D&D second edition as well.
We did. My very first character, I think we probably played about half of that first game in AD&D. And then you got the new book, and we were super excited to try it out and try the new rules. So we converted halfway through into a third edition character. And I think that's really where my passion from the game came from, was third edition.
It's amazing, though, that particular game, 25 years ago now, we can still look back and remember Bowen, and we remember things like the decanter of endless water as a way to power the ship and actually go forward. And it's still amazing how those gaming memories stick with you.
It really is. Yeah. And I think that's one of my favorite character moments of creativity that happened. So I was stuck on this boat and trying to outrun some guards or something like that.
You were involved in some sort of never-do-well kind of activity.
Right. Yeah, as I was at that point in my life all the time. But I didn't have any oars or way to make the boat move, but I did have a decanter of endless water. So it was like one of my first in-game clever moments that I mounted the decanter of endless water to the back of the boat and turned it on geysers. So I basically made my little rowboat into a jet boat. And moments like that are great. They stick in your mind for at least 25 years.
And we didn't know what we were doing back in those days, but still just getting together and playing the game and doing the best we could. It was still a blast.
Awesome. So let's get into our main topic here, building backwards. What does that mean to you? I mean, I know I've got my own ideas on it, and we've talked about it a little bit in the past, but what is the concept of building backwards to you?
Really just knowing where your campaign is supposed to end up. At the end of the day, there's always going to be some sort of thing that the players have to solve, some sort of achievement they're looking for. It could be the defeat of a villain. You could go very classic. They got to save the world from this horrible apocalypse or whatever may be coming. But you need to have a direction. I mean, you can do a lot of things very, very sandboxy in a campaign and give the players a lot of flexibility on where they're going to go and what they're going to do. But if you don't have an overarching direction, an overall place that you need to end up in the campaign, the game can feel a little meaningless, and it can trivialize the experiences. Just because a PC defeats a monster, if there's no stakes, if there's no real reason that they're doing that, it loses meaning, and it just becomes a rolling of the dice more than an actual adventure that is meaningful. So building backwards just means knowing where you're going to end up before you start.
Yeah, and I think there's some really great examples of that in both literature and in cinema. One of the ones that I always refer to when we're talking about building backwards is, of course, Lord of the Rings. Very, very early on what the problem that the party has to solve is, which is destroying the Ring of Power so that they can stop this menacing eye at the top of a tower from somehow taking over the world and destroying mankind as they know it. You don't necessarily know at the beginning how they're going to do that or the challenges they're going to encounter along the way. But their first big quest point is you got to get the Ring of Power to Mordor and throw it in the fires of Mount Doom. So that gives you the idea of, okay, they started with the idea of where it has to end. And now we go back to the beginning and start building the story from there.
That's exactly right. And not every story, the players have to know where it's going to end at the beginning. I mean, that's the wonderful art of foreshadowing that we as storytellers have the flexibility of really playing with. And if you know where your campaign is going to end, it gives you a lot of flexibility to foreshadow encounters, foreshadow things. And one of the things you do particularly well in your own games, Rob, is you'll have a villain in mind with a particular story, and you will let us discover elements of that villain's story, sometimes before we even know it's a villain. Or particularly the big bad evil guy villain for the end.
Yeah, and I think building backwards is particularly useful in that sort of scenario, which is what I like to do. And so you're picking up on something that I've done a lot, which is, yes, I know who the bad guy is going to be, or at least what the big problem that the party has to face is. And then that way, when I go back and I write another adventure early on in the campaign, I can sprinkle elements of hints into that. It also lends really well to plot twists when you're getting towards the end. And if you're trying to build a big plot twist, you got to start planting those seeds early on in the campaign.
Absolutely. I mean, you can always adapt some of the ideas. And you've mentioned this before, when the players are conspiratorially whispering what's really going on around the table. Sometimes you can use some of that as inspiration in the game. And I think that's definitely a useful talent good storytellers will do. But it's so much easier and I think more effective if you have an idea of where the general path of the story goes. And I want to touch really quick on the idea of railroading. I mean, there's this notion in the gaming world that you don't want to tell a railroaded story. You don't want to tell the PCs, okay, now you go here. You want to give them the flexibility to play the game, give them their autonomy, give them their agency. And I want to make it perfectly clear that having an endpoint in mind does not at all dictate the way the PCs get there. They still have that total flexibility and total freedom to adventure in your world as they see fit, but you have something going on that whether they interact with it or not, things will happen in the world. And that grants what I think is one of the most important things in a compelling story, and that's verisimilitude, making the world feel as real as the real world we live in.
Right. Well, that is a very important thing in like enjoying a role-playing game, is being able to suspend your disbelief. But to the point you were making before, the way I like to think about building a campaign is I know where I'm going. Like I think of it as sort of like a road trip, right? So we live here in this place, but we want to take a road trip to the other side of the country. Well, I know where we're going. We're going to go see the Washington Monument or whatever it is on the other side of the country. But there's an unlimited number of roads that we can choose to take to go there. And so I think of myself as the driver. I know where we're ending up and the final place we're going, but I let the characters and the players sort of direct which path we're taking to get there.
Absolutely. And it's a lot of fun, actually, knowing where you're going. I think one of the things that I enjoy the most in for example, the campaign in Tolis that I'm running right now with the rest of the group, I know where the destination is, but none of the players do. So it's a really fun thing for me to be the driver on this journey and letting them explore and experience the dynamic world that I built, and being able to foreshadow numerous late game plot elements that seem utterly meaningless in some cases now, but being able to draw back upon them. And even so far, I mean, we're only, 9th level in the game. Mm-hmm. And at this point, it still feels that there's been moments where the party's like, oh my gosh, that missing girl in the early days, now she's actually important. What's going on with that? And that was session 1. And now we're 30 sessions in, and you're starting to realize the relevance. That's something you don't have unless you're building backwards from the end.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. And I think in terms of railroading, like you were saying a moment ago, it's very similar to that kind of roadmap concept. Is you can choose to just take the easiest route there, the direct path that gets me from the starting point to the ending point. And as the driver, you do have that option, sure. But letting your characters sightsee, go experience the wealth of, I mean, you put a lot of work into a world that you build. You want them to experience that in their own way, and not just the main points that you put on your bullet notes for here's how we get to where I want to be at the end. Let them enrich your world by adding to it along the way.
Exactly. And obviously, a good game master is going to be working on their campaign, not just before the campaign starts like we're talking about today, but also between the sessions. And you still have the flexibility, if you know what general direction the party ends up deciding to go, you have enough time to add some story and add some depth and add some, elements around that. So it doesn't ever straitjacket you into a particular way of going. You still have that flexibility as the game proceeds to proceed in exactly the direction your players want to take it.
So do you have any particular games or any particular moments that stand out to you as looking at them now, you think, oh yeah, he definitely built this from the beginning, or things that you did that you're like, I had to build this from the beginning for it to work out?
There are so many great examples, and particularly in games you and I have played over the years. Obviously, the one that stands out the most is back from Threads of the Desert. This was a campaign that was I was so invested when that turning point happened, or that plot twist happened, that I'm not sure I really liked you as a human being for the first the couple weeks thereafter. But looking back, I mean, you should tell that story. But it's
it's an interesting moment because on the day of the plot twist reveal, I spent that entire day in like this sense of high anxiousness and like goosebumps running through my skin, because I knew what was happening that day. I had planned for it for 8 months or however long we've been playing in this game. Mm-hmm. And when the moment finally came, the big reveal, it was just like, I was ecstatic, like I planned so far ahead for this thing, and now watching it unfold. And so the story is that I had early on in this game asked one of the players to play the big bad evil guy and play through the entire game as a spy, essentially being part of the party's discovery, learning all that they could about him. So he was right there witnessing all of their planning. And like the session before the final big fight, he reveals himself, stabs one of their NPCs in the back and murders her, and then sends them through this labyrinth of traps that he had already planned. And so you all of a sudden go from a party of 4 powerful characters to 2, and they have to go face off against the big bad evil guy who knows all of their plans
and is stronger than we ever realized. No, what was particularly exciting about that, I mean, that's obviously a strong spice. It's not something you can get away with as a GM more than once a decade, I don't think.
For sure.
But it's one of those elements that I still remember thinking, in that campaign, I was talking to one of the other players after the game, and I was thinking to myself, can he do that? Is that allowed?
It's got to be somewhere in the rules that one of the other characters can't be the bad guy, right?
And of course, intuitively, I understood that you told an incredibly good story, and I was so invested in it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the listeners have read books that they've gotten to the end, and they've either been there's been books obviously that you're like, okay, yeah, that was really well wrapped up. Other books you're just craving more, and some books you're like, oh, this is terrible. I hate this, and I want to burn this book and never read it again. And I'll admit that's kind of how I felt about that campaign. But looking back, that's what made it so unique and memorable.
Yeah, that's funny. It's one of those things that I definitely was, I was putting a lot of building backwards techniques into that game. And I don't know if you remember a lot of the puzzles and
absolutely
the dungeons in that game were all specifically about the life of the big bad evil guy. So I had written his backstory first, then attached that backstory to the player who was going to play him. And then you guys are discovering all these elements about his life, which just means that you learn the player that's sitting beside you in 2 different aspects, right? Because you're learning what he is as the big bad evil guy, but you're also learning what he is as the party member who's traveling with you. And then when that twist happened, man, it was like, I think everybody at the table was ready to throttle me, except for the person who was the bad guy and knew it was coming.
Exactly. And the look on his face. I mean, can you imagine being a player who's been working with the game master from the beginning of the game and knowing that that's coming? That's got to be a moment where you almost feel like, okay, this is fun. This is unique. This is nothing like I've ever done before. But it could never be achieved in a game that you didn't know where the story was heading.
Yeah, and that's exactly to my point about plot twists and building backwards, because if you do want to make a great plot twist, you've got to start it from the beginning. You have from the first session, throw something in there, and don't make it obvious. Obviously, like you didn't know that you were learning about his brothers and sisters and all these things about his life. And yes, there were elements of his player character talking about his life that if you had seen it afterwards, you would have been like, oh yeah, they have like the same story. But you didn't know it ahead of time.
Too early.
Right.
And that's the best time to foreshadow. I think at the very, very beginning of sessions, when at the very beginning of a campaign, when you know what your end point is, it's the best time to foreshadow because the players aren't suspicious. They're open to just discovering the world and they're taking it for what it is. So when you throw elements like what seemed like a flavor element, like I mentioned in my Tolos campaign, that a girl was kidnapped and her parents murdered and she went missing and the guard can't find where she is, it seems like an irrelevant flavor detail that kind of gives you an idea of of the feel of the setting that this stuff can happen and it's a dangerous world. But because I knew where I was going with it, I was able to set the stage for something that may not be the end of the game, but it's its own plot element. And you mentioned this earlier, when we're talking about building backwards, we're not talking about just the whole campaign. We're even talking about certain arcs, certain chapters, so to speak, of that campaign. And this is an element that I have that may potentially play into the late game, but I don't want you to know too much about that yet. But it certainly plays into, this mid-level range we are and the story that we're going with, and being able to drop that so early on in the campaign was pivotal, I think, to avoiding any suspicion. Because when you look back, it's obvious that should have been a suspicious, kind of weird situation, but your characters were so new and so fresh and figuring out the world that they didn't really suspect anything, which made it all the more telling when that plot twist and that relevance became important.
Well, I think it is a fun thing too as a player when you see an element that was an early on possible plot thread or just a piece of information that you overheard, but then later on you're seeing like, oh wow, there's a lot more to this than I had thought at my initial investigation, or maybe I just bypassed it and didn't think it was important at the time, forgot all about it, and that just left the problem to grow sometimes, right? If every now and then, you don't have to be upset if players don't latch on to every plot hook that you throw out there. You can just make that a bigger deal later on. And
exactly. It's that 3D element that you're talking about here that basically, if you continue to develop the elements in your game, whether or not the players interact with them or not, it gives it the sense of a living, breathing world. It's not a world that's static, that only changes when the players interact with it, but the world is changing based on the things that they do and the things they don't do.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of, obviously we've talked a lot about this in the macro scale, but you mentioned also doing it on a smaller scale for individual adventures. And I think that's really important too, especially when you're doing the process of planting hints or planting information, or there's a series of events that you want to happen that lead you up to your final point. And so you would do the same thing, right? Like that's how at least that's how I look at it, is I'll have my big problem to solve, but here's some small pieces of that big problem. Now I want to build backwards for each of those little problems for an adventure as well.
That's exactly right. And some of those can tie into your overall main story, but some of them don't need to. And I think it's useful to have both, because then your players are never going to know what's really important to the overall story and what truly is the side quest it appears to be. The specific example I can give you is the most recent session of Tolos we played. You guys were fighting some sort of horrifying, monstrosity, druid, vampire, swarm beast.
That thing was terrible, yeah.
But what you don't know, and I know as a GM, and isn't really a spoiler at this point, the beetles that were Flavor crawling through the tunnels at the beginning. They were insect spies watching the party to see what capabilities the party would have. The next little group of giant spiders were a summon that was specifically controlled to be able to see what abilities the party has. So he was prepared early on against whatever the party had coming based upon, planning ahead and knowing that this was the villain I was going to introduce for this particular mini arc, and knowing that character's abilities and what his goals are and how he was around for so long. I think it adds depth to the story that you wouldn't have without knowing in advance what you're fighting and just, hey, rolling a random encounter and saying, okay, you guys are fighting a Minotaur.
Well, and I have advocated a lot for elimination of unnecessary elements. That's always been something that's kind of been a sticking point of mine. If a description is not really relevant to the story, just say, this room looks like an old larder. You don't need to give 2 paragraphs worth of description for a room that has nothing in it, right?
Sure.
But I think that lends into it as well, is that the important elements that you put in there, like the beetles crawling along, it should cue me to know that if I was running this game and I left that detail in there, there was probably something important about it, but it didn't. I didn't give it away for me. So I think there's also just that, maybe you fall into that, this world feels more real. So I can kind of see that from both points of view. Sometimes there's some important unnecessary details to throw your characters off as well.
It's fun to also use them occasionally as red herrings. Once in a while, I take the time to detail things that truly have no meaning whatsoever. And that's a strong spice too. That can easily be overused. You don't want the player spending half an hour investigating an empty room.
Right.
On the other hand, there are times where when there's already a level of high tension in the party, giving them unnecessary details that they seem important to actually throw them off from what's really going on sometimes can be a very useful element to throw in there as well.
Yeah, I always think of the red herring one as a fun trap is the one where you have like the button in the room that there's a archaic countdown that's taking place. But every time you press the button, the countdown restarts.
Very Lost.
And at the end of the countdown, the door just opens to the other side of the room, but you think that something terrible is going to happen, right? It's like one of the greatest, like it's been used in so many campaigns, but it's such a fun idea of making your players nervous for something that you've put in there that really has no relevance to make them nervous.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into tricks of the trade. Okay, this is Tricks of the Trade, and today we have a few extra ones. I have asked Dustin to come with 5 ideas for campaign or story ideas, and I have 5 of my own. So you get a full 10 Tricks of the Trade today. Dustin, would you like to get us started?
Absolutely. So a dragon takes human form and infiltrates human society, developing a taste for the finer things in life. The PCs are tasked with making this rambunctious adventurer leave a rather puritanical town.
Nice. Dragons are always a lot of fun because they have such a rich cultural, like, there's so much around them, right? You have the whole Draconomicon, and every system that comes out has their own concept of what dragons are. Plus, every mythos has some form of reptilian super monster.
Mm-hmm.
But I also have a dragon one.
Okay.
So mine is the party is traveling along from point A to point B or wherever, and they're approached by a dragon who's shapeshifted into human form, who hands them an egg, their own child, unborn, because they've got chromatic dragon assassins hot on their trail, and they have to get out of there. Dragon takes off, and that's the starting point for either the story or the campaign or the arc or whatever. They have to figure out, what do we do with this egg? Are we going to turn it into our pet? Are we going to try and get it back to its parents? Are we going to sell it and make a lot of money? I just think it's kind of fun giving characters an early on piece of like parenthood they got to deal with.
Sure. What I like about that in particular, especially if the characters don't know why the dragon gave them the egg. The dragon may be running from these other chromatic dragons in threat, but that could be part of the journey of discovery. They have this egg to start with without a lot of explanation for why they were given it in the first place. Is it destiny? Is it fate? Does the dragon pick them in particular, or was it a moment of desperation and he or she had no better option?
Right. Or was it even their egg? Maybe they stole it from another dragon, and now they're going to have that.
I like that.
Dragon looking out for them.
And stories like that are wonderful because the players really don't know which it is. So that gives them time for table talk and for discussion about that in character, which gives a really nice opportunity to develop characters in the early game when they are thrown into the action with something dramatic like that. I really like that. My next one is a PC's grandparent who disappeared decades before suddenly reappears far younger than they should be and claim they've been to the future and come back to prevent something terrible from happening.
You know, I have a flavor for prophecy stories. Mm-hmm. I think they're a lot of fun because they just open up so many possibilities of how does prophecy and fate work. And a hook like this or a story idea like this plays right into what I enjoy because there's just so much interplay with, well, if it is prophecy, is there really anything we can do about it? Mm-hmm. Or are we railroaded into going through the motions and ending up having this devastating fate?
That time travel paradox and the players don't know. I've actually run numerous campaigns, sometimes deciding that it's predestiny and there's nothing you can do about it, and sometimes saying you can change fate. But it's more fun to not let the players know at the beginning how you've decided to handle it for that campaign.
Interesting. All right, so my next idea is there is an ancient curse that affects humanity, and that around puberty or around the time of adulthood, everybody takes on bestial aspects to themselves. For some people, it's very minor. For some people, it's very major, depending on their personality. The overall concept being that every monster that exists in the world was once a human.
That's fun. One of the things I've noticed about your campaigns in general is you like to create the moral quandaries. This is just a group of goblins, but is it right to just kill them?
Yeah, I really do like moral quandaries. There's something about having to make a personal connection to a decision that you make in game. And I think that makes it, you have a little more investment to your decisions when that happens.
Absolutely. Well, my next one, all sources of fire suddenly cease functioning, and it is widely whispered that the god of fire has been killed or imprisoned.
This is so I immediately think of Game of Thrones, the Frozen North kind of aspect, or like the far northern reaches of Faerun, where it becomes a survival game.
Absolutely. When you're trying to not freeze to death, and there, of course, fire is also the sun. Maybe you can't even see the sun in the sky anymore, and now the land is cloaked in darkness, and it becomes a struggle to not only figure out what happened, but in the short term, just survive it.
Oh, that sounds terrifying and fun. Looking forward to playing that game.
There you go.
So my next idea would be that there's a powerful worldwide group of merchants that has been trying to set up travel portals from all of the major cities as a hub for trade. But something goes wrong at the completion of these puzzles, or at the completion of these portals, and when people are entering them, they're not exiting them. And what instead is exiting is creatures or denizens from another plane of existence.
Fascinating. And the question, of course, is, are they being transformed, or are they being replaced?
Yeah, see, and I hadn't even gone into thinking that much about it. I just thought the concept was cool, but the transformed idea is kind of fun, right?
Especially if no one knows that that's the case early on. They slay some of these monsters, and then they learn that they actually were the friends that went into the portals.
See, I like that. That's another fun twist to it.
There you go. A representative from a local influential group arrives at the village to take the PCs with them to fulfill a destiny spoken of in an ancient prophecy. A little bit more direct in the prophecy route, but I like that an influential group somehow knows what's coming and ropes the PCs into it. I think very Wheel of Time with coming in the Aes Sedai grabbing the heroes early on.
Yeah, again, prophecy stories, one of my favorite things to play in. I think I like this idea particularly a lot because it sort of sweeps up your players into the story and kind of doesn't really give them a choice. A lot of times I'm in favor of character choice, but sometimes in early on, taking them out of their cushy, simple life and throwing them into like a torrential river of plot is really cool.
I think when you talked about railroading earlier, the only two times that no one really objects to railroading is the very beginning and the very end. If you give them the flexibility in the story to go the direction they want, nobody minds being swept up in your story in the beginning, and nobody minds achieving the conclusion you had in mind from the beginning.
Which is the whole idea of the roadmap we're talking about, right? You have a starting point and you have an ending point, but you let them pick all the sightseeing stops along the way.
Exactly.
So my next idea is the party is traveling to the New World on a gnomish airship. So it's a land that they don't really know about, but it is starting to be colonized. But on the way, the airship suffers some sort of solar storm, or perhaps it's sabotaged, and it goes down in the uncharted wilderness where nobody has any idea where things are at. They're marooned in this place, and they have to decide what they're going to do from then on.
There's so many wonderful elements you can pull with that too. Obviously, you have the whole frontier element. What's here, we don't know. But you also have the gnomish airship elements of, is this strange technology, a weird form of magic? How did the gnomes do this? And why did it fail? And maybe the way we need to get home is rebuilding the airship, but we need to discover why it went down in the first place to figure out how to prevent that. There's so many different directions you as a game master can go with that.
And I like the idea of doing something like a gnomish airship more than like a traditional, boat on the water, because it does give them that little bit of access to technology that might be beyond them, but could also be really useful in a dangerous setting like that.
Sure. I like the idea of very low level characters with either simple firearms or some sort of a magical technology that would allow them to survive in an uncharted wild while still feeling the real danger that is present there. Well, my last idea, I just came up with this one actually yesterday. A powerful immortal was killed a century ago, but has somehow delayed death using a powerful charged artifact that allows him to delay his fate. But the artifact is running short on power, and thus the immortal is running short on time.
Powerful immortals become far more dangerous in games when they feel threatened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the trope behind a lot of really big, epic, long-running campaigns is somebody very powerful is threatened, and they have to do whatever they can to extend their life or to solve their solution. I like when players get caught up in that kind of stuff.
Well, it's a lot of fun because this is a type of story where the players are going to have no clue why the events in the world are taking place. Why now? Why is there this war? Why is there this sudden hunt for a special medicine in a distant land? Why are all these things happening? And they'll have no idea until much, much later in the campaign. And then the most fun part is, are they going to help the immortal? Are they enemies with the immortal? Or maybe they're going to try to steal its power.
Yeah, I like that last one a lot. That might be what I chose to do in that game. So my last idea is the weapon of the god of war has been lost somewhere in the world, and two warring nations are scrambling to be the first to find it to win the war. So you would have the whole concept of which side are the players on, and really giving them early on the idea that their quest is going to decide which way the world is going to end up.
That's fun. Missing artifacts are always a wonderful, that's how artifacts are meant to be used in a story. They're not intended to be given as loot to a PC or even an NPC necessarily, but more as an overarching sweeping plot device. Who gets a hold of this gets to determine the fate of the world. There's a lot of compelling interest there.
I like players' decisions having the ability to affect the entire world, especially the more powerful they become. I think that needs to carry more weight. Their decisions need to be a big part of what shapes the future of the world that they're living in.
Exactly.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our session. Please subscribe to my podcast. Check out my book, Session Zero, The DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. It is available on Amazon. There is also a link in the session notes. Also, feel free to email me if you have any questions, comments, suggestions for future shows. The address is all one word. It's dungeonsdragonpsychology@gmail.com. We will see you next week. Dustin is going to be back with me. We're going to be talking a little bit more about world building, and we're going to take it from a slightly different aspect, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Dustin, for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. I look forward to the next one.
And thank you for listening to the podcast. We'll see you next session.